Hi class, welcome to lesson number 32. This continuing course of macroeconomics, we have been talking about different things. We've been talking about the multiplier effect, we've been talking about spending, we've talked about consumption, government spending, investments, net exports, whatnot. Before I start into new stuff, which is going to include things on aggregate demand, the tax multiplier, and the balanced budget multiplier, and a lot more, I want to cover the homework question, okay? The first thing we asked was define me based on a formula, define me MPC and MPS. And basically what that translates to is marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. MPC is equal to delta C, which is change in consumption over the change in DI. And MPS is the change in savings or the change in DI. Pretty simple, but pretty important as well. So don't forget to write that down. On my left, I asked you guys to graph. This graph is sort of slanted, so I'm a little sorry about that. But for the most part, understand that we're trying to graph the investment demand schedule. Okay, the investment demand function is kind of downward sloping, right? Why is that, you ask? Because at high interest rates, right, it's difficult for people to borrow because money is expensive to borrow. At lower interest rates, money is cheaper to borrow, so there's more investment. Okay. Simple concept. This is why the investment demand is downward sloping. Still important to know. So based on those two, that was the answer to the homework question. So that being said, let's jump into the new stuff, which is tax multiplier. I'm going to start off with tax multiplier. We talked about the multiplier effect on when you spend money as a government, right? When you said government spending, we said, well, it's 1 over 1 minus MPC. And we said that when the government spends money, the effect is quite huge, right? Now, we also discussed the fact that when there's a tax multiplier, it's a smaller multiplier effect than the government spending. I'm going to say that one more time. Tax multiplier is always smaller than the government multiplier. Why would that happen? Because government spending goes directly into consumption, whereas tax multiplier goes into consumption and savings, and only consumption is the one that gives you the multiplier effect. All right, so formulaically, this is how we write down the tax multiplier. The tax multiplier is equal to the MPC, or the marginal propensity to consume, okay, over the MPS, or the marginal propensity to save. All right, pretty important. Write it down. You're going to see this in the test. I guarantee it. It's going to come up, and if you don't know it, you sort of sit there and you're like, why did I not know this? So please go ahead and remember that it's MPC over MPS for tax multiplier, and it's 1 over MPS for the government spending multiplier. All right, that being said, I need to discuss one more multiplier before I leave, and that's the balanced budget multiplier. Some governments are asked to balance their budgets, which means that the amount of money they make in terms of tax revenue and the amount of money they spend in terms of government spending has to be equivalent to each other. So the question is always, well, say government spends $100, the government collects taxes of $100, what is the net effect? And the net effect is multiplier is always 1, okay? It's always 1. So the government spending is equivalent to the tax revenue. Well, in that case, the balanced budget multiplier is always equivalent to 1. Just remember that, just in case it shows up, I just want to cover it. Okay, now the biggest topic to cover is aggregate demand, all right? So we're going to be working with this a lot, and let's first write down aggregate demand and what it actually talks about, okay? So aggregate demand is actually an interesting concept, because what it does is it talks about the relationship between the amount of money that you're spending on domestic output and the average price level of the output. Let's talk about that. So when we actually graph AD, okay, the AD, or aggregate demand, talks about two things. It talks about price level, okay? On the other side, it talks about real GDP, or RGDP. So it talks about the amount of spending you're doing on domestic output and the amount that is at your price level, all right? So why is AD downward sloping? Okay, because as you shift, okay, your RGDP, okay, as you shift your RGDP and you're going towards higher price levels, okay, obviously things become more expensive. But why do we shift why do we shift up, right? And why do we reduce our GDP rather than going the other way? And why is it not positive sloped? Because what happens is, as we increase our price levels, okay, a unit of GDP is substituted, okay? So what are these substitutes? So let me go with that, okay? Let me talk about a unit of GDP, our GDPs, okay? A unit of our GDP, it's substitutes, okay? So one of the first things we talk about is goods and services provided in other countries. Pretty straightforward, right? So why is the reason that a lot that you find today in the market is actually made in China? Well, the fact is that prices to not only make, but to consume these goods, if they're made in the US, has become really expensive. So people have gone, firms have gone out to other countries, and consumers are able to consume goods from other countries because they're actually affordable. Okay, so as this price level rises, what they do is they substitute this unit of GDP, okay, with goods and services provided by other countries. Okay, what's another way that they do this? They also go to the future. Actually, they rely on the future. So what is this? They provide goods and services in future. What does that mean? Simply means that they borrow money. Okay, they borrow money. They use interest rates, and they actually borrow on tomorrow, right? So as price levels go up, right, you borrow money, and what that causes is a whole bunch of reactions. Your interest rates go up, your investments go down, price levels go up, and our GDP goes down. All right. So it's a interesting chain reaction that happens because as price levels go up and people borrow more, okay, as they borrow more, all right, your investments are going to take a hit because what's going to happen is that money is demanded more and interest rates go up, and the cycle is not good from there on, okay? So you don't have to know the chain reaction to that. Just know that there are three particular substitutes to the unit of GDP that we're talking about. One is other nations, two is borrowing, three is the yes, I want to talk about this, money and financial assets. All right, so let's say that you as a person have invested in a mutual fund, all right? And what's happening is that price levels are going up and your salary relatively is not making enough money for your lifestyle. So what you're going to do is you're going to start selling those assets. So assets also play a role, okay? Financial assets also play a role because you're going to sell those assets for cash, and that cash you're going to use so that you counteract those price levels, all right? So these are the three main substitutes for a unit of GDP, all right? So that being said, let's move on to changes in GDP, in AD, changes in AD. How does AD change and why does AD change? All right, for this I'm going to talk about four different things, all right? Four different things. You guys have probably seen this before, and these letters probably should look same. C, I, G, X minus M. Okay? What is that? Consumption, investments, government spending, net exports. All right, cool. What does that say? All right. If my price levels were constant, okay, so my price levels, PL, I'm going to say that as price level, is constant, okay? What's going to happen is if any of these go up, okay, if any of these go up, AD goes up, okay, because AD is made of these, all right? So AD goes up. AD goes up, all right, my RGDP goes up. RGDP goes up. My RGDP goes up, then things are good from there, right? Because you're more employment, your economy is doing a lot better, output is increased, people are in general better off. Okay. Now, if all of these holding price level constant again go down, then AD goes down, right? And then your RGDP goes down. Okay, so remember that. Okay, so that being said, we've tried to cover those. Now, let's try to break down individually, all right? So if consumption goes up, what happens? Well, consumption goes up if there's more money that people are getting. So let's say that our GDP has gone up and things are looking better and people all of a sudden make better wages, right? So their consumption is going to go up. Or if they're optimistic, let's say in the future, the economists come out and they're like, in the future, we predict that the economy is going to get better. So their wages are going to rise. What people are going to do is, hey, you know what? The better days are coming. We can spend more money because our income's going to rise. Investment goes up if you're optimistic about the future, right? So let's say that the future investments, you expect a higher rate of returns. You're going to start investing more. Or the interest rates go down. If borrowing becomes cheaper, you will invest. Third is government. Why would government spend more? They could, and how can government spend more? Well, they normally inject money if there's a recessionary economy, all right? More money goes in if they feel that the economy is not doing so great, so that when they spend that money, it gets multiplied and the economy kicks off a little better. Or they can reduce the taxes, right? Or they can increase the transfers. Now, the other last part is the X minus M part, the next net exports. If net exports go up, obviously AD goes up, all right? So what happens when AD goes up? There's a little bit of a tail effect that goes on in here. So if the foreign incomes increase, okay, that means that other nations around the world are doing better and they're trading partners with the US. They're going to generally have more purchasing power and they're going to buy more of our imports, right? They're going to buy more of our, they're going to buy more of our exports, okay? What if consumer tastes change? What if people think that American jeans are the style in the world and no other jeans are being consumed? So all of a sudden, there's a higher demand for American jeans, more exports go out. Okay, so consumer tastes are important. Finally, exchange rates are really important. If US currency falls, things become more affordable and countries such as Canada, Mexico, you name it, can start buying American products because they're relatively cheaper than before. Okay, so we talked a little bit about AD, aggregate demand, but trust me, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how to shift AD, backwards and forwards, because we need to, we're either battling inflation or battling a recession, but either way, we're going to come back to that. For now, I want to talk a little bit about aggregate supply. Okay, on my left, I'm going to start erasing the board, and we'll talk a little bit about aggregate supply and what that really means in terms of a definition. Aggregate supply is, we talked about aggregate demand being a relationship between the price level and our GDP. Well, aggregate supply is a relationship between the average price level and the level of domestic output. Okay, so how would we actually graph that? Right? How would we actually graph an AS? What is on either side? Well, surprise, it's the same thing as before, right? It's price level and it's our GDP. But AS actually is not downward sloping at all. It actually looks quite different. It actually kind of looks like this, okay? And for AS, or aggregate supply, there's three different parts, okay? There's the flat area, okay, we'll call that 1. There's the area until it kind of takes off exponentially, we'll call that 2. And then there's this part where the exponential curve, and we'll call that area 3. So the AS, or excuse me, this is the SRAS actually, short run aggregate supply curve, has 3 different regions, all right? It has flat area, it's expanding, and then there's the exponential part. All right, so why is this critical? Well, normally in a recession, we're somewhere in area 1, okay? We're somewhere in area 1. We're hanging around right here, okay? Low GDP. Okay, our GDP is at recession. I'll call it our GDPR for now. What about at this particular point? Well, this particular point, we're actually at our full employment, our GDPF, because right here, around this area, economy is doing great. Everyone's fully employed. Remember, fully employed does not mean there's 0% unemployment rate. There's actually still an unemployment rate, but there's only frictional and structural, no cyclical. So we're at full employment. And lastly is this area of the region where prices kind of take off exponentially, all right? We got to be careful of this because this is an area where inflation is a huge problem, okay? So during a recession, we're about here. Full employment, we're about here, okay? So this being said, this is really important to understand the shifts in this graph because we try to understand if we're in a recession, right, for example, how do we fix different problems? How do we fix if our AD, for example, is right about here, right? AD. How do we make sure the AD shifts to the right, okay? And what kind of repercussions does it have on the price level and on the RGDP, all right? So this is something we're going to talk about more in detail. But I'll tell you this. As RGDP increases at this point in time, it approaches more towards the full employment rate, which is a good thing, right? Because RGDP is basically increasing while your prices have moderately gone up, okay? So that is a good thing. But let's say we're in area 3, okay? Well, let's say we're in area 3 in AD, right? My AD is over here, and we shift here, okay? My prices have actually gone up exponentially, while my RGDP has actually increased not so much, right? Not relatively, by a very small amount. So area 2, we're increasing our AD. If we're shifting our AD from 81 to 82, let's say, we increase both our price levels and our RGDP. Area 1, if we shift our AD to 81 to 82, we shift the RGDP, but the price levels don't change as much, okay? So getting out of recession in terms of AD is quite nice because you don't affect price levels, but at the same time, you're shifting your RGDP quite dramatically. Area 2, you're affecting price levels and RGDP, and then area 3, only price levels and not as much as your RGDP. Okay, so we've tried to broken that down into 3 different areas for you to understand, we'll come back to that as well, and we'll try to draw it in 3 shapes all the time, and so that you understand, and we'll try to talk about the 3 different areas, but the point of this class is to kind of go over stage 1, 2, and 3, and how each shift actually affects the price level and the RGDP level. Okay, so what we're going to concentrate now is the shifts in aggregate supply. Okay, the shifts in aggregate supply. What shifts in aggregate supply, right? Why is an AS curve shifting to the right or left? And the reasons are as follows, and we'll try to differentiate this in 2 ways: short run and long run. Okay, so first let's talk about short run shifts. Okay, let's talk about short run shifts. There are a couple different reasons. Long run and short run don't have much overlap, except that if it's prolonged, obviously it affects in the long run. All right. So short run, there are a couple different things. Let's start first with the input prices. Okay. This is SR, standing for short run shifts. Okay, short run shifts. 1, input prices. Why would my AS, this is AS short run shifts, guys, aggregate supply short run shifts. Why would my input prices change? Input prices, why would they shift my AS? Well, think about it. If my input prices, right, let's take a resource. I'm making something. Let's say I make, let's take something fun, all right? Let's say I am making, I don't know, I do love cars, guys, so we'll stick to cars, all right? So let's say I'm making Ferraris, all right? You're making great Ferraris, great company, fun cars, fast cars, whatnot. And what do you need to make a car, right? You need some aluminum, these days carbon fiber. So if the cost of these raw materials go down, right? If my input prices go down, right? What that's going to create is more profits for me, right? Think about it. My costs are going down. I'm charging just as much for my car, right? And I'm going to make more money, right? So your input prices will shift the AS curve to the right, okay? They will shift the AS curves to the right, okay? So let's talk, or to the left. Input prices go up, AS shifts to the left. Let's talk about tax policy, all right? Why is tax policy important? What if I start taxing more on Ferraris, okay? On high-end cars, the government decides, you know what, Ferrari's making too much money. We're going to start taxing high-end retailers like Lamborghini and Ferrari. Well, obviously it's going to create a bad effect on our AS, and our AS is actually going to shift on the left, right? That's going to create a negative effect. But what if we might have a tax policy saying, you know what, we love Ferraris, we're going to create a good time for Ferraris. Tax policy, government of Italy says, you know what, guys, reduce the tax on Ferraris, right? That's going to make our AS shift to the right, okay? So remember that. Third, we're going to talk about deregulation, okay? Deregulation, why is deregulation important? Deregulation is important for a couple of different reasons. Understand that no matter what industry you operate in, chances are that it's being watched and regulated by the government and its law, right? There's very few times when industries are not regulated completely. So there's some sort of legislation, right? So if I am making cars, I have to make sure that there's particular mileage. I have to make sure that it reaches some safety ratings, whatnot. So there's a lot of rules, right? And so it kind of constricts me in making profits as a firm. But if there's deregulation, right, it says, hey, you know what? We're going to leave it up to you to do whatever you want to do, right? So we're going to, as a firm, make the most optimal way of making a Ferrari. So what deregulation does is it increases AS and it shifts to the right. Fourth, lastly, is politics or environment, okay? Environment / politics. Okay, so what do these two do? Environment, what if there's a disaster, a tsunami, right? Come into my factory, destroys it. Obviously, my AS shifts dramatically to the left, right? Let's say politically, let's say that there's a politician in town that loves Ferraris, right? He goes ahead and makes deregulation happen for high-end retailers, right? So environment and politics also affect the AS. And depending on what happens, right, if there's a disaster, AS shifts to the left. If the environment helps for some reason, it shifts to the right. Politics help, shifts to the right. Politics don't, shifts to the left. And by right, I mean AS goes up, guys, okay? So in the short run, these are the shifts. Now let's talk about the long run shifts for AS, okay? What shifts in the long run? And you guys can probably think about this already, right? We talked about it a little bit before. We talked about the production possibilities frontier. We talked about how technology is a big help, right? Technology helps a lot. So already hinting at the fact that, you know, when you see a long run shift, you're probably chances are you're going to see technological progress. And let's start off with the LR. Okay, so long run shifts for AS. What shifts the aggregate supply, right, in the long run? Well, let's start with technology and productivity, okay? So tech and productivity, right? Why are these important? Well, let's say that, let's continue this Ferrari. My factory, all of a sudden, I have a machine that makes, you know, twice as much Ferraris as I've done before. Well, obviously, if I could just have the same amount of money, right, and I make twice as much, right, I get to sell twice as many cars, provided there's a demand, obviously. But the point is that I get to make cars cheaper, and that's going to help me, and my AS is going to shift right, okay? And this is in the long run, all right? So my long run aggregate supply is going to shift. Next comes availability of resources. So why are resources important? Well, let's say that for some reason, right, my Ferrari factory found a whole bunch of aluminum and carbon fiber somewhere, okay? And I have a whole bunch of it more, and they're much cheaper. Well, that helps a lot, right? If you think about it, my resource input prices kind of come down. We talked about this in short run, right? And all of a sudden, my AS shifts to the right, okay? Resources. 3 is policy that helps dictate cars, right? So in our particular case, Ferraris, let's say that the government is helping out car manufacturers, and that policy also, if it is permanently in effect, will help us in the long run, and the AS will actually shift to the right. Okay, so that being said, we talked about how we shift in the short run and the long run, all right? But what really makes sense is, can we graph the long run, right? Think about long run, right? So AS, we said in the short run, has 3 different regions. We said it has a horizontal region part where that's kind of, it's growing, and then we said there's an exponential part. So what about LRAS? Okay, so we had it. Let's draw SRAS just for fun. Price level, right? There is RGDP. Okay, this is my SRAS. I have horizontal area that's growing, and then an area that's kind of taking off exponentially. That's kind of a smooth curve. I kind of made it more distinct here. But actually, we talked about the point where full employment exists is somewhere right about here, let's say, okay? Full employment, right? That's where the GDP is operating. GDPF, as I called it, was full employment, right? A lot of people call it GDPF. But this is where actually my LRAS actually exists. My long-run aggregate supply actually exists where the GDP is at full employment. Okay, that's the way you graph that. That being said, let's talk about the fact that we have a short-run shift and a long-run shift. Let's see how that actually graphically moves. All right, so let's say for some reason that there is a input price. We're making Ferraris, and you know, Ferraris are made out of carbon fiber, and the cost of carbon fiber has come down dramatically. Okay, what's going to happen is that my SRAS is actually going to shift, right? So this is SRAS1, okay, and it's going to shift, and make sure it's parallel shift always, okay, and it's going to shift to SRAS2. All right. So what that's going to say is that, well, we have, first of all, we have a higher GDP, okay? Because if you want to graph, right? If you want to graph the equilibrium, right? We've just shifted our GDP. So GDP is actually to the right. Price levels have actually come down, right? So this seems to be a win-win situation. In fact, if the input prices for carbon fiber actually come down permanently, then what ends up happening is my LRAS actually shifts to the right as well, creating a new full employment rate, okay? And this is LRAS1. Make your graphs big so that people can read them fast and clearly, and make sure you label everything, all right? So that's the way you shift in the long run and in the short run. That being said, let's talk a little bit more about macroeconomics and how it relates to the AD, the aggregate demand. Because right now we've only talked about the AS curve separately and the AD curve separately. I talked a little bit before in this example about shifting AD, but let's plug the AD into a short-run aggregate supply graph. All right. So how does it work? Where does the AD come in? What happens? And let's talk about a recession, right? Which we've had in about 2008, 2009 when the banks failed. There was a crisis, right? There's a big recession. And let's say for all argument's sake, right? Let's say that we said that this is the horizontal part, right? We said that there was a growing part and we said the exponential part, okay? SRAS. We said full employment's right about here, maybe a little bit to the right. So let me just erase it a little bit. Okay, let me draw LRAS right down here. Okay, and I said that we're in a recession. So for those of you who remember, if there's a recession, right, AD is probably in the horizontal area, okay? So let's say AD is right about here, all right? So if AD is here, this is AD, okay? This is where my current GDP is at, okay? And GDPR, standing for GDP recession. My price levels are right about here, all right? So depending on what we do, our AD shifts either to the right or to the left. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next class about how we can shift this and what we call different shifts. But before I get into anything else new, we'll wait for the next lesson. But let me just recap real quick what are the things that we went over. All right, we talked about changes in AD. We talked about aggregate demand in pretty much in a lot of detail. We talked about the fact that what happens when price levels go up and how we substitute. We talked about how different parts of the aggregate demand, such as consumption, savings, government spending, and net exports impact, consumption, investment and government spending and the net exports impact aggregate demand. We also talked about aggregate supply, right? We graphed aggregate supply. We said there was stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. We graphed the long run AS, and then we talked about short run and long run shifts, which 100% you have to make sure you know. All right, so that being said, let's talk about the homework question And the homework question for you is as follows. In the short run, what shifts AS? Okay. In the short run, what shifts aggregate supply? Come back with the answer and we'll meet you in the next lesson. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Thank you. Bye-bye.